Less than 1 hour before signing a $950 million deal, the CEO slid a termination letter toward me and called security. She thought she was erasing a difficult engineer. She had no idea the entire acquisition relied on a patent registered solely under my name. By sunset, the deal was frozen. The board was rushing to Detroit, and the woman she tried to ruin became the only person who could save or destroy the company. My name is Maya Perry, and I have always believed that numbers do not lie. Even when the people presenting them do. I am 39 years old, a materials architect specializing in battery systems and thermal safety. For the past 6 years, my life has been defined by thermal thresholds, chemical stability, and keeping heavy commercial vehicles from catching fire on the highway. I do not talk much. I let my work speak. But on the morning of the $950 million signing between Blackridge Thermal Systems and Argent Fleet Mobility, I learned that silence in the corporate world is just an invitation for someone else to steal your voice. The executive floor of our Detroit headquarters was suffocating. It was a sea of tailored Navy suits, expensive perfumes, and the nervous electric hum of impending wealth. Investors mingled by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray city skyline. Legal teams huddled in tight circles, clutching leather-bound folios. The public relations department was already positioning cameras in the corner of the boardroom, adjusting the lighting to capture the exact moment Blackridge transitioned from a struggling tech manufacturer to an industry titan. It was supposed to be a coronation. I sat near the middle of the long mahogany table, nursing a black coffee. I was the architect of the Cascade Shield technology, the only reason Argent Fleet Mobility was in this room. The safety protocols I designed were the heartbeat of this entire merger, yet I could feel the invisible wall separating me from the rest of the executive team. The heavy glass doors swung open. Evelyn Sloan walked in. Evelyn, our chief executive officer, did not bother with greetings. She did not smile for the cameras or shake hands with the lead investors. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor with the rhythmic, calculated precision of a metronome. She moved with a predatory grace, bypassing the empty chair at the head of the table and walking directly toward me. The low chatter in the room began to quiet down. People noticed the trajectory of her path. Evelyn stopped right beside my chair. She did not look at me at first. She simply reached into the inner pocket of her designer blazer and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. She dropped it flat onto the polished mahogany right in front of my coffee cup. The heavy thud seemed to echo in the sudden, sharp silence of the room. "Organizational restructuring," Evelyn said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth or regret. It was a voice practiced in boardrooms and rehearsed in front of mirrors. I looked down at the envelope. It did not take a genius to know what was inside. This was not a quiet human resources meeting scheduled for a Friday afternoon. This was a public execution. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to strip me of my title, my access, and my credibility in front of the very people who were about to buy my life's work. I glanced across the expansive table. Grant Vail, our highly ambitious chief strategy officer, was already setting up his presentation. Grant was a man who built his entire career on standing next to smart people and taking the credit. On the massive screen behind him, the title slide of the technical brief glowed brightly. It was my slide deck. I had spent 70 hours over the last 2 weeks building every graph, every thermal degradation model, and every stress test visualization. But right there, under the bold heading of Cascade Shield Architecture, the line that should have read, "Lead Architect Maya Perry," was entirely blank. My name had been surgically scrubbed from the record. I looked back up at Evelyn. Her eyes were hard, calculating. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to raise my voice, to cry, to throw a fit, so she could easily justify calling security to escort the unstable, emotional engineer out of the building. "We are entering a new phase of expansion," Evelyn continued, her volume pitched just loud enough for the Argent executives to hear. "Blackridge needs an investor-friendly leadership face moving forward. We need strategists who understand global markets. We do not need someone who lives in a lab and struggles with corporate alignment. Security is waiting by the elevators to assist you with your personal items. I did not flinch. I did not blink. Panic is a chemical reaction, and I have spent my entire adult life learning how to control volatile reactions. Instead of looking at the termination letter, I let my gaze drift to the center of the table. The master deal binder sat there, 3 inches thick, bound in dark leather. It was the binder that held the acquisition documents. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, and pulled the binder 2 inches closer to me. Grant shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn's jaw tightened. I opened the heavy cover and flipped past the executive summary, past the financial disclosures, and went straight to the technical asset schedules. I have a photographic memory for documentation. I knew exactly where the core technology usage rights were supposed to be. I scanned the index. Section 4, subsection B. I flipped to the tab. It was gone. The appendix detailing the intellectual property transfer of the Cascade Shield foundational architecture had been entirely omitted from the closing documents. They were trying to sell a house without handing over the deed. Hoping the buyer was too distracted by the fresh coat of paint to check the property lines, Evelyn tapped her manicured fingernail against the termination envelope. Sign the acknowledgement. Maya, do not make this harder than it has to be. You are holding up the schedule. I slowly closed the leather binder. I pushed it back to the exact center of the table. I looked at Evelyn, then at Grant, and finally, my eyes locked onto the lead legal counsel for Argent Fleet Mobility, a sharp-looking man in a gray suit who was currently holding a very expensive fountain pen. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a scientist stating an absolute, undeniable fact. Before anyone signs a single piece of paper today, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, stagnant air of the boardroom, I have one question. The entire room froze. The public relations team stopped adjusting their cameras. The investors lowered their coffee cups. Evelyn glared at me, a flash of genuine panic finally breaking through her icy facade. I looked directly at the Argent lawyer. Who just confirmed that Blackridge Thermal Systems actually owns the foundational patent to Cascade Shield? The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that consumes oxygen. The lawyer from Argent Fleet Mobility froze. The fountain pen hovered exactly 2 inches above the signature line. He slowly lowered the pen to the table. He looked at Evelyn, then at his own team, and finally, he looked down at the massive pile of due diligence paperwork sitting in front of him. He reached out and stopped his associate from flipping any more pages. The atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The smell of expensive coffee and victory evaporated, instantly replaced by the cold, metallic scent of a multi-million-dollar disaster. "Excuse me?" the Argent lawyer asked, his voice tight, stripping away all the friendly corporate pleasantries they had exchanged all morning. "What did you just say?" Evelyn stepped forward, her composure cracking. "She is a disgruntled employee being terminated for cause. Do not listen to her. This is a desperate stunt." "I am the inventor," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly level. "And I asked a legal question regarding the chain of title for the core technology you are about to purchase for nearly $1 billion. I will ask it one more time. Who in this room has verified the ownership of that patent?" Grant Vale went completely pale. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of a plane and realized he forgot his parachute. The presentation on the screen behind him, filled with my stolen data, suddenly looked like a massive legal liability. I did not touch the termination envelope. I leaned back in my chair, interlaced my fingers, and watched the panic take root. They wanted an investor-friendly face. They were about to get a masterclass in risk management. "I need to see the IP asset schedule," the Argent lawyer commanded, his tone now entirely hostile as he turned toward Evelyn. "Right now." Evelyn did not move. She could not. She knew what was in the binder, and more importantly, she knew what was missing. They thought they were performing a clean surgical extraction of a problem employee. They thought they were burying me alive right before the confetti dropped, but they forgot one crucial detail about people who live in labs. We build things from the ground up. We know exactly where the structural weaknesses are. And I had just pulled the keystone out from under their entire deal. To understand how we arrived at a boardroom frozen in terror, you have to rewind 7 years, back then. Blackridge Thermal Systems was not a titan of industry. It was a bleeding startup on the verge of total bankruptcy, choking on the ashes of its own failed prototypes. We were trying to build high-capacity battery packs for heavy commercial transit. Instead, we were building bombs. 2 catastrophic thermal runaway incidents had already occurred during closed-track testing. When a massive lithium cell fails, it does not just quietly die. It violently vents toxic gases and ignites, creating an unstoppable chain reaction that consumes neighboring cells in seconds, burning at nearly 2,000 degrees. The board of directors was actively preparing to liquidate the assets. I was a junior materials scientist at the time, surrounded by senior engineers who kept trying to solve a fundamental chemistry problem with heavy, expensive mechanical cooling systems. They were essentially throwing cups of water at a grease fire. I knew the answer was not about cooling the entire massive pack. It was about isolating the microscopic failure before it could spread. That was how Cascade Shield was born. It is a multi-layer thermal propagation barrier. If one single cell goes critical, the shield instantly absorbs the kinetic shock and chemically solidifies, walling off the extreme heat like a heavy fire door in a burning skyscraper. The adjacent cells never even feel the temperature spike. It sounds like standard practice now, but it was revolutionary at the time. Here is the exact detail Evelyn Sloan deliberately ignored when she decided I was expendable. I did not invent the core matrix of Cascade Shield on Blackridge Company time. The foundational chemistry, the exact polymer blending technique that made the barrier function under extreme stress, was born from my own independent postgraduate research 2 years before I ever scanned an employee badge at their front door. I brought the baseline architecture with me. I only adapted it into a commercial format using their testing modules. Samuel Dyer, the original founder of Blackridge, knew this completely. Samuel was an engineer first and a businessman second. After our second prototype burned a testing facility to the ground, he came directly to my cramped cubicle. He looked entirely exhausted, his tie undone, carrying the massive weight of 200 employees about to lose their livelihoods. "Maya," he said, pulling up a cheap folding chair, "the federal safety inspectors are giving us one last shot next month. If we do not pass, the factory doors close permanently. I know your propagation shield is still your personal property. I know we have not negotiated a formal purchase, but I'm begging you, let us integrate it into the alpha build today. If it saves the company, I swear to you, the minute our Series B funding clears, we will execute a proper, permanent licensing buyout that sets you up for life." I trusted Samuel. We sat down with his lawyer and I drafted a temporary licensing option. It was a very specific legal mechanism. It granted Blackridge the exclusive right to use the technology for commercial testing and a 36-month window to negotiate a permanent transfer of ownership. It explicitly did not hand over the deed to my intellectual property. It was a temporary bridge, not a final bill of sale. We installed Cascade Shield. We ran the federal test. The intentional trigger cell exploded, and the fire died exactly where it started. The entire pack survived. Blackridge survived. Within 18 months, the company was the new undisputed darling of the transport electrification sector. We were no longer simply selling batteries. We were selling absolute guaranteed safety. The massive commercial contracts rolled in. Then, Samuel died of a sudden massive stroke, and the actual soul of the company died right along with him. The board of directors brought in Evelyn Sloan to prepare us for the major leagues. Evelyn did not care about the delicate chemistry of a battery cell. She cared exclusively about the chemistry of a balance sheet. Her mandate was aggressive management, clean public relations, and beautiful quarterly growth. Almost overnight, the entire culture shifted. The engineers who built the foundation were pushed down into the basement laboratories, replaced on the top executive floor by people who wore expensive suits and spoke endlessly in synergy and market penetration. That is when Grant Vail began his meteoric ascent. Grant was hired as a mid-level strategy manager, but his true and only talent was corporate translation. He could not calculate a thermal load curve to save his own life, but he knew exactly how to put my dense, 50-page technical reports into highly digestible, visually stunning slide decks. At first, it was collaborative. Grant would ask me to explain the heat dissipation metrics, and he would present them to the investors. As Maya Perry's team has proven, he would say from the podium, but corporate greed is a slow, creeping erosion. By the third quarter of Evelyn's tenure, Maya Perry's team subtly became our advanced engineering division. By the second year, my name was entirely removed from the title slides of the quarterly financial updates. When I questioned Grant about it in the hallway outside the elevators, he gave me a highly practiced, deeply sympathetic smile. "It is just a strict formatting mandate from Evelyn," Grant explained smoothly, adjusting his silk tie. "She wants the company to appear totally unified, single brand identity for the investors. It is absolutely nothing personal. Maya, we all know you are the real brain behind the shield." They knew I was the brain, but they desperately wanted the world to think Blackridge was the body, mind, and soul of the technology. I stopped getting invitations to the preliminary investor dinners. Then, I was quietly excluded from the internal strategy meetings. Eventually, the very executives selling my safety architecture to foreign markets had never even seen my face. They were erasing me, piece by piece, turning my life's work into a faceless corporate asset that they could take full credit for. Friends outside the industry asked me why I stayed. They told me to walk away, to take my flawless resume to a rival competitor who would put my name in bright lights and pay me double. They thought I was being incredibly naive, suffering from some misplaced, foolish loyalty to a company that was actively burying me alive. But I was not naive. I stayed because of the pilot line. Every single morning, I walked the main factory floor. I saw the young technicians, the assembly line workers, and the junior quality control engineers. They were building high-voltage systems that would eventually sit underneath yellow school buses, crowded city transit lines, and heavy freight trucks. They were working with incredibly dangerous, volatile energy. And the only thing standing between a safe morning commute and a catastrophic headline tragedy was the exact chemical mixture I personally calibrated every single week. I stayed because those factory workers trusted my safety protocols. If I walked out the door and let Grant Vail and Evelyn Sloan completely take over the manufacturing process, I knew exactly what would happen. They would instantly start cutting corners to boost the profit margins. They would replace my high-grade thermal polymers with cheaper, inferior alternatives just to make the quarterly earnings look 5% better. They would fatally compromise the integrity of the shield because they did not understand the underlying science. They only understood the financial cost. I swallowed my pride. I let them take the unearned credit in the air-conditioned boardrooms. As long as I could maintain absolute control over the quality in the laboratory, I traded my personal ego for the physical safety of the product. But as the massive Argent Fleet Mobility merger approached, Evelyn and Grant realized a terrifying, unavoidable truth. They were about to sell a $950 million house, and I still held the only legal key to the front door. The 36-month negotiation window from Samuel's original temporary agreement had quietly expired 3 full years ago. They had been so completely focused on hiding me in the shadows that they forgot to legally acquire the very thing keeping them in the light. They needed me gone before the auditors dug too deep, but they needed my ghost to stay behind forever. The warning signs did not start with the termination envelope sliding across the boardroom table. They started exactly 6 weeks before the acquisition date, creeping into my daily routine like a slow leak of carbon monoxide. Odorless, invisible, and meticulously designed to suffocate you before you even realize the air has been completely poisoned. It began with my digital calendar. For 5 solid years, I was the first person dialed into any technical review regarding our battery systems, but suddenly, my schedule was completely clear. I would walk down the main corridor and see the executive conference rooms booked solid through the frosted glass partitions. I saw the engineering team from Argent Fleet Mobility on the large video monitors. They were running deep due diligence on the safety architecture. They were asking highly specific, complex questions about the thermal load tolerances of the barrier matrix. And the only person who actually wrote those structural tolerances, was sitting quietly at my desk, locked out of the network invites. When I checked the shared server to review the presentation materials Grant Vail was preparing for these critical calls, I noticed the vocabulary had shifted. It was a subtle, cowardly edit at first. The phrase invented by Maya Perry was completely wiped from the history of the product development timeline. Instead, the polished slides now proudly proclaimed the technology was developed by Blackridge Innovation Leadership. They were systematically diluting my existence, spreading my individual, isolated achievement across a vague, faceless corporate collective. I might have let the slides go. I was accustomed to Grant stealing the spotlight to justify his massive salary. But then I saw the raw data from the latest stress test. Someone had smoothed out the thermal degradation curve on the final slide deck. The numbers were technically within a passing grade, but they had been artificially rounded up to look perfectly flawless for the Argent executives. The reality was that at continuous peak voltage, the physical barrier showed a 2% structural weakness under extreme heat. It was a minor anomaly I was already working day and night to patch in the laboratory, but it was absolutely not a perfect zero. I drafted a highly factual, completely emotionless email to the testing director, copying Grant. I simply asked why the raw lab data did not match the executive summary being presented to a buyer. 48 hours later, I was sitting in a windowless room in the Human Resources Department. The Human Resources Director, a woman with a sympathetic smile that never quite reached her cold eyes, slid a thick manila folder across the table. It was a formal behavioral warning. Suddenly, after years of stellar performance reviews and perfect safety records, I was being officially documented as difficult to collaborate with and combative regarding internal communication. They cited my entirely factual email about the test data as an explicit example of creating a hostile work environment. I stared at the paper. I did not argue. I did not defend my tone or raise my voice to justify my actions. I realized exactly what they were doing, and fighting back in that room would only give them the ammunition they desperately wanted. They were not trying to improve my corporate communication skills. They were building a paper trail. They were manufacturing a legally defensible reason to terminate a high-level technical architect right before a massive financial event. They needed a file thick enough to prove to any outside observer that my dismissal was strictly about my attitude and entirely disconnected from the intellectual property they were about to sell. The invisible walls were closing in, but the final, undeniable proof of their trap arrived 3 days later. Evelyn Sloan summoned me to her corner office on the executive floor. It was a remarkably rare occurrence. She was sitting behind her massive glass desk, smiling warmly as I walked in. It was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen her wear. "Maya," Evelyn said, gesturing smoothly to a silver fountain pen resting on a crisp, perfectly aligned stack of legal paper. "The Argent merger is moving into the final legal clearance phase. Their corporate lawyers are being incredibly pedantic about historical paperwork. They want all senior staff to sign updated, standardized intellectual property acknowledgments. It is just a routine housekeeping matter. Standard retroactive work for higher confirmation." I picked up the document. I read the first paragraph. I read the second. My heart rate remained steady, but my mind was racing through the legal implications. It was not a standard update. It was a complete, unconditional surrender. The contract was specifically, aggressively worded to retroactively classify every single thought, design, formula, and prototype I had ever created, both prior to and during my employment at Blackridge, as the sole default property of the company. If I signed that piece of paper, my independent research from years ago, the very foundation of Cascade Shield, would instantly and permanently belong to Evelyn. "I cannot sign this right now," I said smoothly, setting the pen down gently on the glass desk. "I have a personal lawyer who reviews all my binding contracts. It is just my standard protocol for legal documents. I will get it back to you by next week." Evelyn's warm smile vanished instantly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "This is not a negotiation. Maya, we are closing a $950 million acquisition in a matter of weeks. I need that file complete and filed today. Do not hold up the entire company over a meaningless formality." "It is not a formality," I replied, standing up slowly. "It is a transfer of ownership. I will have my counsel review it." I walked out of her office. I did not look back. I knew the clock had just run out. I was no longer just an annoying engineer. I was officially a massive liability. I did not panic. I did not pack my bags or call a lawyer to draft a desperate lawsuit. I went straight back to my desk and began the quiet, meticulous work of a scientist preparing for a catastrophic system failure. If they were building a paper trail of lies to destroy me, I was going to build a clear record of evidence. I spent the next 2 weeks working late into the night, long after the executive floor had emptied out. I bypassed the main corporate servers and dug deeply into the archived physical storage networks. I brought a portable encrypted hard drive. I downloaded every single email thread between myself and the late Samuel Dyer. I scanned my original, handwritten laboratory notebooks, making absolutely sure the dates from 4 years ago were clearly visible in the digital copies. I found the personal credit card invoices where I paid for the raw polymer materials out of my own pocket, months before Blackridge ever offered me a formal job. But the most important thing I found was a forgotten email thread buried deep in an old legal server. It was a correspondence between Samuel and the former corporate counsel, dated exactly 3 weeks before Samuel died. I read the words on the glowing monitor, and my blood ran completely cold. Samuel had written, "We absolutely cannot promote the thermal shield as our permanent, proprietary asset to any future investors. The temporary licensing window is strictly finite. Do not list it as a hard asset on the balance sheet until Maya signs a voluntary, final transfer agreement. We owe her our survival. We will do this by the book." I pulled up the digital copy of the original licensing option we had signed. The expiration date was exactly 3 years ago. I sat back in the dim, humming light of the empty server room. The sheer magnitude of the deception finally washed over me. It was not just corporate bullying. It was not just an arrogant vice president stealing credit on a PowerPoint slide. It was monumental, astronomical fraud. Evelyn and Grant were not just trying to push an irritating engineer out of the spotlight before they popped the expensive champagne. They were actively trying to sell a lie at the center of the deal. They had built an entire empire, attracted a massive corporate buyer, and promised guaranteed safety to the public, all based on a piece of intellectual property they legally did not own, and had not owned for 36 months. When I refused to sign that retroactive trap in Evelyn's office, I became the only living obstacle who could expose the rot at the exact center of their massive deal. They thought they could fire me, discredit my professional reputation with a fake human resources file, and quietly forge ahead to collect their massive bonuses. They thought they were playing a brilliant, cutthroat game of corporate chess. They had no idea I had already taken the entire board. The echo of my question had barely settled against the polished walls of the boardroom before the Argent lead counsel, a man whose end-of-year bonus depended entirely on flawless corporate due diligence, slammed his hands flat against the mahogany table. "I want to see the complete chain of title," the Argent lawyer demanded, his voice completely devoid of any previous collaborative warmth. "Not the polished executive summary, not a brightly colored slide deck. I want the original, physically executed transfer agreement for the foundational patent. Right now." Nolan Price, the chief legal counsel for Blackridge Thermal Systems, stood up immediately. He adjusted his expensive designer glasses with an arrogant, practiced ease. Nolan was a man who truly believed his Ivy League law degree made him entirely immune to administrative errors or foundational oversights. "This is highly irregular and completely unnecessary," Nolan scoffed, aggressively opening his sleek silver laptop. The intellectual property schedules were fully vetted during the preliminary discovery phase last quarter. "We have all the necessary legal documentation loaded into the secure digital data room. Everyone just take a breath. Give me 1 second to pull up the final signed copies." The massive boardroom fell entirely silent except for the rapid, overconfident clicking of Nolan's keyboard. He navigated the complex internal legal network with swift keystrokes. I sat perfectly still in my chair and watched his face. For the first 30 seconds, he looked mildly annoyed by the interruption. At 45 seconds, his jaw clenched tightly and his posture stiffened. At exactly 1 minute, a single, highly visible drop of sweat formed near his hairline and slowly rolled down his temple. He was digging desperately through the encrypted digital archives, searching frantically for a document that simply did not exist. He clicked through the expired temporary licensing folder. He rapidly checked the master employment contracts. He checked the specific administrative folder where the retroactive agreement Evelyn had tried to force on me was supposed to be filed. Slowly, Nolan lifted his hands away from the keyboard as if the aluminum surface were suddenly electrified. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his complexion a sickening, chalky shade of gray. He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes wide with absolute terror, completely speechless. The Argent legal team did not need to hear him speak a single word. They could read the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the Blackridge side of the table. "Let me be absolutely clear about our position here," the Argent lead executive stated, his voice dropping an octave, cutting through the heavy, stagnant air like a surgical blade. "We are not purchasing this company for your older manufacturing facilities. We are not buying your brand name, and we certainly are not buying your executive leadership structure. The exclusive, proprietary ownership of the thermal propagation barrier is the sole, central reason we agreed to a $950 million valuation. If you do not legally own the central safety architecture, this entire transaction is fundamentally fraudulent." Evelyn tried to interject, her voice high, thin, and strained. "It is just a clerical oversight. A minor filing delay from the previous administration. We can have this completely resolved by the end of the business day." "You have exactly 72 hours, the Argent executive interrupted coldly, standing up abruptly and buttoning his suit jacket. "We are officially suspending the acquisition process. We are initiating an immediate, emergency forensic legal audit of your entire intellectual property portfolio. Until my legal team sees an ironclad, uncontested patent transfer signed voluntarily by the original inventor, nobody in this room is signing anything." The Argent executives and their massive legal team packed their briefcases in absolute, furious silence and marched out of the room. Immediately, the polished, triumphant facade of the executive floor shattered into pieces. The public relations director frantically waved her hands, signaling the audiovisual team to cut the power. The bright, warm studio lights that had been meticulously set up to capture the historic signing ceremony went completely dark. The expensive cameras were hastily shoved back into their black transport cases. The celebratory atmosphere instantly turned into a chaotic, panicked crime scene. Before I could even gather my coat and stand up, Evelyn gripped my arm with surprising, desperate strength. She did not call the security guards waiting by the elevators. Instead, she practically dragged me into a small, soundproof executive briefing room just off the main corporate hallway. Grant Vail rushed in right behind us, his face slick with sweat, and slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt. The shift in Evelyn's demeanor was incredibly jarring. The cold, calculating chief executive who had just tried to fire me publicly was entirely gone. In her place was a cornered, panicked woman desperately trying to negotiate for her professional survival. "Okay, Maya," Evelyn said, her voice suddenly soft and practiced. "Let's take a breath and look at the bigger picture. We all allowed the immense stress of the acquisition to get the better of us out there. I will be the first to admit, the termination notice was incredibly premature. It was a severe lapse in judgment on my part." I stood near the door, keeping a wide physical distance between us. It was not a lapse in judgment. It was a highly calculated attempt to steal. "Listen to me very carefully," Evelyn pleaded, rapidly opening a leather portfolio on the small round table between us. "We can fix this right now. You do not want to destroy this incredible company. and I certainly want to compensate you fairly for your immense historical contributions. If you sign the retroactive transfer agreement right now, legally backdated to last week, I will personally guarantee an unprecedented executive exit package. $2 million in fully liquid stock options, a glowing letter of recommendation for any firm in the country, and a 5-year non-disparagement clause protecting your reputation. You walk away rich, and we save the deal. Everyone wins. Grant stepped forward, holding up his hands in a highly practiced, calming gesture. He was rapidly shifting into the role of the reasonable mediator, attempting to apply massive emotional manipulation. Maya, please think about the collateral damage, Grant urged softly, his eyes wide with feigned sincerity. This is not just about Evelyn or me. We have over 2,000 dedicated employees in the manufacturing division downstairs. If Argent walks away because of a patent dispute, the board of directors will completely panic. The company stock will plummet. We will have to lay off half the factory floor by next month just to stay solvent. Thousands of hard-working families in Detroit will lose their livelihoods just because you want to prove a technical legal point. You have always been a team player. Do not punish the line workers for a management dispute. I looked at Grant, feeling a profound, absolute disgust settling in my stomach. They were actually trying to weaponize my own deeply held empathy against me. Do not ever use the factory workers to justify your own towering incompetence, I replied, my voice hard, flat, and steady. You two built a massive house of cards on a foundation you deliberately stole. And Evelyn, this is absolutely not about a severance package. Keep your $2 million. This is about the undeniable fact that nobody in that boardroom has the right to lie about a technology that is directly tied to human lives on the highway. I leaned slightly closer to them, making absolutely sure they heard and understood every single word. You are fully willing to sell an inferior, rushed version of my safety architecture just to hit a strict financial deadline. You are willing to compromise the thermal integrity of the barrier to save a few dollars on mass manufacturing costs. If I sign that piece of paper and walk away to a comfortable retirement, you will put highly defective, dangerous battery systems on the public roads. I will never let you turn my life-saving research into a lethal public liability just so you can cash a massive bonus check. The answer is absolutely no. I turned around, unlocked the heavy oak door, and walked out of the briefing room without waiting for a response. By the time I reached the main elevator bank, the internal corporate grapevine was already operating at maximum capacity. The entire building was practically vibrating with the invisible shockwave. Executive assistants were whispering furiously in the break rooms. Junior legal associates were frantically printing out massive stacks of old employment contracts, running down the hallways. The manufacturing floor managers were continuously texting the senior engineering team, aggressively demanding to know why the catered champagne delivery had just been abruptly canceled. The rumor was spreading like a highly combustible gas through the building ventilation shafts. The dominant story was no longer about a successful, historic corporate merger. The story was entirely about the quiet, brilliant woman from the basement laboratory who had just been publicly humiliated and ordered out of the building. And how, in the span of exactly 4 minutes, that same woman had completely paralyzed the executive board, terrified the billionaire buyers, and become the one person everyone in the company suddenly had to reckon with. They had aggressively tried to throw me out on the street. Now, they were firmly trapped in the building with me, and they were finally realizing I held all the keys to the exits. Judith Rowan, the chairwoman of the board for Blackridge Thermal Systems, did not believe in corporate coincidences. She believed entirely in audit trails. Less than 12 hours after the acquisition collapsed in spectacular fashion, her private charter touched down in Detroit. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the executive floor had been transformed from a victory lounge into a hostile interrogation center. Her first official act was not to speak to Evelyn Sloan. It was a direct call to the head of Internal Information Technology. Within 10 minutes, every single physical and digital file related to the Argent Fleet Mobility merger was frozen under a strict corporate preservation order. Nobody could delete an email, alter a spreadsheet, or shred a memo without triggering a board-level security alert. Judith convened the emergency meeting in the same glass-walled room where my termination had been staged just one day prior. She sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by two independent forensic auditors. She had flown in directly from New York. Nolan Price was the first executive to break under the pressure. The chief legal counsel sat across from Judith, his designer suit looking completely rumpled, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. "I need you to explain the timeline, Nolan," Judith said, her voice dropping into a dangerously quiet, precise register. "And I need you to remember that your absolute fiduciary duty is to the board of directors, not to the chief executive officer." Nolan swallowed hard. He opened his physical folder, his hands visibly shaking. During the routine internal audits 4 months ago, a junior associate flagged a major discrepancy in the intellectual property chain of title regarding the Cascade Shield architecture. The temporary licensing option we held had completely expired. We flagged it as a severe risk factor in a highly confidential legal memo to the executive suite. "You found a fatal flaw in the legal ownership of our flagship technology 4 months ago," Judith repeated slowly, letting the gravity of the incompetence hang heavily in the air. Why was this not immediately escalated to the board of directors for emergency review? Evelyn assured me it was merely a clerical oversight. Nolan stammered, refusing to make eye contact with anyone at the table. She explicitly stated she was handling the final signature directly with the lead engineer. She gave a direct executive order to the legal department to compartmentalize the risk so it would not spook the investors during the preliminary valuation phases. Judith turned her attention to the massive stack of printed emails the auditors had compiled overnight. She possessed a terrifying ability to read the dangerous spaces between the lines of corporate communication. "Let us talk about those investors," Judith said, pulling a specific page from the stack. 2 months ago, the technical due diligence team from Argent explicitly requested an in-person meeting with the primary inventor named in the original filing documents. They wanted to speak directly with Maya Perry to verify the thermal threshold limits. Evelyn sat rigidly in her chair, her face a mask of highly practiced neutrality. Maya was deeply engaged in critical laboratory work at that time. We could not spare her for routine administrative meetings. I made a strategic management decision to handle the partner communications through the dedicated strategy office. "You made a deliberate decision to hide her," Judith corrected sharply, sliding the printed email across the table. "This is your direct written order to the network administrator, instructing them to permanently remove Maya Perry from all shared calendar invites involving Argent executives. You actively built a firewall around her." The forensic auditor sitting to Judith's left handed over another neatly categorized file. This one bore the distinct letterhead of the Human Resources Department. "Which brings us to the sudden, incredibly convenient termination," Judith continued, flipping open the file with surgical precision. "I spent my morning reading Maya Perry's employment history. For 6 solid years, she has received absolutely flawless technical evaluations. Yet, exactly 3 weeks after the legal department flagged the missing patent transfer, the Human Resources Director suddenly receives a written mandate from your office, Evelyn. The mandate explicitly orders them to begin building a behavioral profile on Maya. You manufactured a fake paper trail to make her look unstable, combative, and difficult to manage. She was creating a completely hostile work environment," Evelyn insisted, her voice tight but unwavering. "She was aggressively questioning finalized data points and causing unnecessary friction within the manufacturing teams." Judith did not raise her voice. She simply pulled out a transcript of internal instant messages recovered directly from the corporate server. "Friction," Judith mused coldly. "Let us look at how the strategy office described this friction. Here is a direct digital exchange between Evelyn Sloan and Grant Vale, dated exactly 5 days before the scheduled signing ceremony. Grant writes, 'The Argent guys are getting nervous about the missing signature. The lab girl is refusing to sign the retroactive sweep,' Evelyn replies. 'I am handling the termination. Have the human resources file ready by Friday,' and Grant responds, 'Good.' Investors want a bright, manageable face on the executive team, not a difficult technical woman who cannot play the corporate game. The boardroom went dead silent. Grant Vail stared down at his own hands, his ambitious career effectively evaporating right in front of his eyes. Judith set the paper down. She looked at Evelyn not with anger, but with profound, analytical disgust. The entire picture was now perfectly clear to the board. This was never a standard management action. It was a desperate, malicious cover-up. Evelyn had realized the foundational patent was out of her control. Instead of negotiating fairly with the engineer who literally saved the company, she tried to legally assassinate my character, separate me from the building under a cloud of behavioral issues, and push the $950 million deal across the finish line before the buyers realized the vault was completely empty. "You did not just risk a single financial transaction," Judith stated, her tone final and absolute. "You risked the entire existence of Blackridge Thermal Systems. You actively deceived a major corporate buyer, and you attempted to destroy the career of the only person who actually understands the safety architecture keeping our products from exploding on the highway." Judith stood up. The inquiry was over. Effective immediately, Evelyn Sloan is entirely stripped of all executive authority regarding the Argent acquisition, Judith announced to the room. "You are suspended from all daily operations pending a full independent investigation. Grant Vail, your strategic advisory role is terminated as of this minute. Furthermore, the board is confiscating all company-issued hardware. Laptops, mobile devices, and secure drives are to be surrendered to the forensic team before you leave this room. We are bringing in outside digital forensics to map every single keystroke you have made over the past 6 months." 2 corporate security officers stepped quietly into the boardroom, waiting to escort the former power players to the exits. Grant looked entirely defeated, quietly sliding his sleek silver laptop across the polished mahogany table, but Evelyn remained completely defiant. She stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing the wrinkles from her designer skirt. She still deeply believed she was the smartest person in any room she walked into. She believed that power was simply a matter of controlling the public narrative, regardless of the underlying truth. "You are making a massive, emotional mistake, Judith," Evelyn said coldly, refusing to surrender her device until the security officer took it directly from her hands. "You are handing the keys of a billion-dollar enterprise to a highly emotional, greedy engineer who is actively sabotaging this company for her own personal financial gain. The board of directors will beg me to return when she completely destroys the Argent relationship with her ridiculous technical demands." Evelyn walked out of the boardroom with her head held high, completely convinced she could still spin the catastrophe into a victory. She truly believed she could launch a shadow campaign, leveraging her vast network of industry contacts to paint me as the villain. She thought she could outmaneuver the truth by simply shouting her lies loud enough to the business press. She still did not understand that the shiny, polished veneer of her corporate leadership had already cracked beyond repair. The board of directors was no longer looking at her perfectly crafted slide decks. They were looking at the raw, undeniable data, and the data proved exactly what I had known for years. The 24 hours following the boardroom suspension were chaotic, but not for me. While Blackridge Thermal Systems descended into an absolute corporate civil war, my personal phone began to ring incessantly. The corporate world is incredibly small, and the collapse of the acquisition makes a massive noise. Rumors had leaked out of the executive suite almost instantly. By noon the next day, every major rival and private equity firm in the transportation sector knew exactly why the deal had frozen. They knew the patent was legally mine, and they knew I was entirely unbound. My inbox flooded with lucrative invitations. A massive technology conglomerate in Silicon Valley offered to buy the Cascade Shield patent outright for a sum that would guarantee I never had to look at a battery cell again. A prominent venture capital fund wanted to finance a brand new startup with me as the sole founder, but the most aggressive offer came from a massive battery manufacturing consortium based out of Denver. Their legal team sent over a term sheet offering an immediate 8-figure signing bonus, total creative control, and a guaranteed percentage of all future licensing revenue. It was enough money to walk away from the industry completely, buy a quiet house in the mountains, and let Evelyn Sloan and Grant Vail drown in the toxic corporate mess they had created. I printed the Denver offer, folded it carefully, and put it in my coat pocket. That evening, I sat in a faded vinyl booth at a small, dimly lit diner on the edge of the city. Owen Mercer sat across from me, quietly stirring his black coffee. Owen is my longtime partner, and for 15 years, he was a senior manufacturing engineer on the heavy assembly lines. He has the rough, calloused hands of a man who actually built things, and the quiet, steady demeanor of someone who has survived multiple rounds of massive corporate layoffs. He understands the heavy, unseen cost of terrible executive leadership better than anyone I have ever met. He knows exactly what happens to the working class when the people in the tailored suits make reckless, greedy decisions. I slid the folded paper across the scratched laminate table. Owen picked it up, read the massive financial figures, and slowly placed it back down next to his coffee cup. He did not look surprised. He did not immediately tell me to sign it, nor did he beg me to go back and fight the Blackridge Board of Directors. "It is a very clean exit, Maya," Owen said softly, his voice grounded and completely devoid of judgment. "You have fought this quiet battle for over 3 years. You built the foundation. They tried to bury you under it, and now you hold the only shovel. You have every right to take the money, move to Colorado, and let that entire company collapse under the weight of its own terrible management." I looked out the diner window at the passing headlights. If I take the Denver deal, Evelyn loses her job, but the corporate system stays exactly the same. Blackridge will just hire another brilliant, naive engineer, steal their work, and put another dangerous product on the market to satisfy the quarterly earnings report. Owen nodded slowly. That is the reality of the machine. But you have to ask yourself what you actually want. If all the people who know how to build the foundation keep retreating, the second things get difficult. The people who only know how to make colorful slide decks will keep controlling everyone else's future. His words hit the exact center of the conflict tearing through my mind. It was not about the money. I had never cared about the staggering financial figures. I picked up my phone. The screen lit up with dozens of unread text messages. They were not from headhunters or corporate lawyers. They were from the junior engineering staff back at Blackridge. A flood of messages from the young female engineers in the quality assurance and reliability testing departments had been pouring in since the previous afternoon. They did not know the exact legal details of the patent dispute, but they knew I had stood up to the chief executive officer right before the biggest financial signing in company history. They thanked me for not simply packing my desk and disappearing quietly into the background, like so many technical experts before me. They thanked me for forcing the executive team to actually acknowledge the laboratory floor. Before making a final decision, I needed to see the reality of what I was leaving behind. Late that night, I used my security badge, which the board of directors had wisely reactivated, to enter the main production facility. The executive offices upstairs were dark, but the massive factory floor operates 24 hours a day. I walked along the elevated steel catwalk overlooking the pilot assembly line. The air smelled faintly of ozone and industrial solvent. Below me, dozens of technicians in protective gear were carefully assembling the heavy commercial battery modules. I watched a senior line manager consult a brightly colored safety protocol manual mounted near the testing chamber. I recognized the layout of the manual instantly. I had written every single word of those safety tolerances. I watched the automated robotic arms inject the specific thermal polymer I had formulated into the cooling channels. The safety architecture I created was not just a theoretical concept living in a legal binder on a mahogany table. It was a physical reality being utilized every single day by hardworking people to ensure that buses carrying children and trucks hauling freight did not turn into fatal, unstoppable fires. Looking down at the bright factory floor, the lingering resentment I felt toward Evelyn Sloan completely vanished, replaced by a cold, highly focused sense of absolute clarity. This fight was no longer about my bruised ego. It was not about simply proving a greedy chief executive wrong or securing a massive retirement fund. It was a battle to reclaim pure authorship. It was about demanding the absolute right to be called by my correct name, and forcing the people who make the final corporate decisions to bear the full, crushing responsibility for the physical hardware they attach to real vehicles out on the public highways. If I simply walked away, I would be abandoning the very safety culture I had bled to build. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a direct number. Judith Rowan answered on the second ring. Even at midnight, the chairwoman of the board sounded wide awake and sharply focused. "Maya," Judith said smoothly, "I assume you are calling to discuss the parameters of a potential return to the company. The board is prepared to offer a highly significant compensation package and a newly created senior technical title. We want to make this right. I am not calling to negotiate a title." "Judith," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely resolute, "I have read the preliminary offers your legal team sent over. I know you want to handle this quietly. You want to execute a private settlement, issue a vague press release about leadership restructuring, and pretend the systemic rot inside the executive suite never existed." Judith was silent for a long moment. "Corporate stability requires a certain level of discretion. Maya, the market does not react well to public executions." "Then the market will have to adjust," I stated firmly. "I am not agreeing to any backroom settlement. I will not sign a single piece of paper, and I will not authorize the use of the Cascade Shield patent for the Argent merger under closed doors. I have exactly one condition for my return." "Name it," Judith instructed cautiously. "Tomorrow morning, you are going to convene the entire board of directors, the senior legal team, and the executive representatives from Argent Fleet Mobility," I said, "and I am going to present the complete, unfiltered timeline of exactly what Evelyn Sloan and Grant Vail did. Every altered test result, every hidden email, and every deliberate attempt to compromise public safety for financial gain will be laid bare on the table. There will be absolutely no private bargaining. If you want my technology to save your $950 million deal, the entire truth gets exposed under the brightest lights we have." I did not wait for her to argue about corporate optics. I ended the call, turned my back on the empty catwalk, and walked out of the factory, ready to tear their polished, deceitful empire down to the studs. The 72-hour suspension was supposed to be a purely legal freeze, a time for lawyers to argue over intellectual property clauses and missing signatures. But the engineers at Argent Fleet Mobility did not spend those hours looking at contracts. They spent them inside their own independent testing facility in Chicago, tearing down the physical sample battery packs we had provided during the preliminary due diligence phase. At 8 o'clock in the morning on the second day of the freeze, Judith Rowan forwarded an encrypted data packet directly to my personal terminal. The subject line was completely blank. I opened the attached files and found raw thermal impedance graphs generated by Argent's independent testing lab. They had run the sample modules through a simulated high-stress environment. I stared at the degradation curves on my monitor, and a cold, heavy knot formed instantly in my stomach. The numbers were wrong. They were not catastrophically failing, but the thermal resistance was dropping exactly 4% faster than the baseline models I had built in my own laboratory. To a corporate executive, a 4% variance is a rounding error. To a thermal architect, it is a glaring, screaming siren. I cross-referenced the Argent test data with the master manufacturing supply manifest. It took me less than 20 minutes to find the exact point of failure. It was buried deep within a procurement schedule approved entirely by Grant Vail. 6 months ago, Grant had quietly authorized a vendor switch for the binding adhesive used in the cell assembly matrix. He swapped my specified aerospace-grade polymer for a commercial-grade alternative. The commercial glue was significantly cheaper. By making that single, completely unauthorized substitution, Grant had artificially bumped the projected profit margin of the mass production line by exactly 14 cents per battery cell, spread across a $950 million commercial rollout. That tiny substitution looked like a brilliant cost-saving victory on a quarterly spreadsheet, but Grant was not an engineer. He did not understand how materials interact under extreme kinetic duress. The cheaper adhesive was perfectly fine in a temperate climate under a normal driving load, but Argent was a commercial fleet company. Their clients drove heavy transit buses and freight trucks. If you took a commercial vehicle equipped with that cheaper adhesive, drove it through a desert environment operating at 110 degrees, and subjected it to continuous aggressive fast charging cycles, the cheaper glue would physically melt. It would liquefy and create a microscopic thermal bridge right past the cascade shield barrier. If a single cell vented in that specific scenario, the shield would be completely bypassed. The fire would spread instantly. Blackridge was not just trying to steal my patent. They were actively pushing a fundamentally compromised, lethally dangerous product into the largest commercial transit deal in North American history just to make their profit margins look marginally better for the final valuation. The stakes instantly skyrocketed. This was no longer a quiet boardroom dispute over intellectual property ownership or injured professional pride. It was an active, ticking public safety hazard. I was still staring at the damning supply chain manifest when Tessa Boone quietly walked into my office and closed the door behind her. Tessa was our senior compliance specialist. She had spent the last 4 years being systematically ignored, talked over, and politely dismissed by Evelyn and her executive inner circle. Compliance officers are the immune system of a manufacturing company, but Evelyn treated Tessa like an irritating roadblock to aggressive market expansion. Tessa did not say a word. She simply walked over to my desk, set down a thick, heavy black binder, and slid it toward me. "I saw the boardroom clear out yesterday," Tessa said, her voice shaking slightly but her eyes completely locked with mine. "I heard they suspended Evelyn and Grant. I have been waiting 3 years for someone to finally break their armor. I think you are going to need this." I opened the black binder. It was a meticulously organized record of everything they had tried to hide. Tessa had secretly preserved every single internal compliance report, failed stress test, and safety warning that the executive suite had actively ordered her to delete from the central servers. She had the physical printouts. She had the metadata. She had the digital signatures of every executive who had manually overridden her safety protocols. I flipped past the failed structural tests and the ignored vendor warnings until I reached a heavily highlighted internal memo dated exactly 4 weeks before the Argent deal was finalized. It was an email directly from Evelyn Sloan to Grant Vale, discussing the exact thermal degradation issues caused by his cheaper adhesive substitute. The words on the page were chilling in their casual, corporate sociopathy. "We acknowledge the minor thermal variance in the new assembly matrix," Evelyn had written. "However, replacing the adhesive now would force a massive supply chain delay and jeopardize the third quarter closing window. We proceed with the current configuration. We close the transaction first. Once the capital injection clears, we can fund an aggressive research and development cycle and quietly issue an optimization patch to the fleet operators next year. Secure the funding at all costs." She knew. Evelyn Sloan knew the product was compromised under extreme conditions, and she made a calculated decision to gamble with human lives rather than delay a massive financial payday. She intended to sell a fire hazard to public transit authorities and use their own purchase money to figure out how to fix it later. A deep, consuming anger washed over me. It was a cold, precise fury. They had called me difficult. They had called me emotional. They had tried to paint me as a greedy, uncooperative scientist standing in the way of American industrial progress. But they were the ones willing to put thousands of commuters at risk of burning alive in a 2,000-degree lithium fire, simply to ensure their massive executive bonuses cleared the bank before the end of the fiscal year. My desk phone rang. It was Judith Rowan. She was calling from the secure executive conference room where the board of directors was currently holding an emergency strategy session. "Maya, we have a major development," Judith said immediately. "The Argent legal team just formally submitted their independent testing data. They found the variance in the thermal load. They are demanding an immediate explanation regarding the material substitution. The entire board is completely panicking. Half of them want to offer Argent a massive discount to keep them at the table, and the other half want to declare bankruptcy right now to shield our personal liability." "Do not offer them a discount, Judith," I replied. my voice harder and sharper than it had ever been. A discount does not stop a battery from exploding on a highway in July. I have the supply chain manifests, and I have something much worse. I told Judith exactly what Tessa Boone had just placed on my desk. I read Evelyn's internal memo aloud over the secure line. I read the exact sentence where the chief executive officer of a major safety technology company explicitly ordered her team to hide a critical engineering failure to secure a $950 million check. The line went completely dead silent for almost a full minute. I could hear the faint, ambient hum of the corporate air conditioning through the receiver. When Judith finally spoke, the polished, diplomatic tone of a board chairwoman was entirely gone. "This is no longer a corporate restructuring problem, Maya," Judith said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "This is criminal fraud. If Evelyn pushed a defective safety design into a federal transit bid and actively hid the failure data, she is looking at federal prison time. And if the board of directors attempts to cover this up with a quiet financial settlement, we are all going to prison right alongside her. Then we do not cover it up," I said simply. "If you walk into the full investigative hearing tomorrow and present that binder," Judith warned, laying out the absolute finality of the situation, "you will not just be invalidating a termination letter. You will be providing the board with the exact legal ammunition we need to completely annihilate the current executive team. We will strip them of their stock, void their severance packages, and hand them directly to the federal regulators. It will be a bloodbath. It might destroy the public image of the company forever. The company's image is already built on a lie," I fired back. "The only thing that matters now is the structural integrity of the actual product. I will not let them put that defective shield on the market. I will present the timeline. I will present the failed tests. And I will present Evelyn's own words. I want them out. Not just reassigned, not quietly retired with a golden parachute. I want them completely removed from the industry." "Get your documents in order, Maya," Judith instructed, a sharp edge of predatory anticipation entering her voice. "The formal hearing is at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Bring the compliance officer with you. We are going to tear the walls down." I hung up the phone. I looked at Tessa, who was still standing quietly by the door, waiting for a verdict. I slid the heavy black binder under my arm and stood up. The battle over who got the credit was officially over. The war to protect the public from corporate monsters had just begun. Evelyn Sloan was backed into a legal corner, and cornered corporate animals do not surrender gracefully. They bite with everything they have left. By the time the sun rose on the third day of the legal freeze, she had launched her desperate counteroffensive. She knew the board of directors was actively loading the gun to terminate her completely, so she decided to burn the entire forest down to save herself. Early that morning, a highly targeted hit piece appeared on a minor but heavily circulated corporate finance blog. The headline was incredibly aggressive. It framed an unnamed rogue scientist as a greedy opportunist holding a massive domestic manufacturing revival hostage. The article painted me as a selfish, emotional roadblock who cared significantly more about squeezing the company for personal royalty payments than protecting the 2,000 hard-working assembly line workers in Detroit whose jobs were suddenly in jeopardy. It was a classic corporate smear tactic, designed to weaponize public sympathy and internal company panic against a single target. My personal legal counsel called me at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning. He had already run the text of the online article through a standard linguistic analysis software. He compared the exact phrasing of the hit piece against the massive digital dump of internal corporate communications Judith Rowan had frozen and shared with our team the previous night. The results were entirely undeniable. A highly specific, extremely aggressive sentence accusing me of weaponizing foundational patents against the American economic supply chain was a 100% verbatim match to a draft memorandum sitting directly in Evelyn's own sent folder. She had used her personal public relations contacts to plant a dirty, fabricated story. She was hoping that massive public pressure, combined with the terrifying threat of mass layoffs on the factory floor, would force me to sign the retroactive transfer just to stop the bleeding. I did not call a press conference. I did not log onto social media to defend my professional character or scream about the glaring injustice. Shouting is a tactic reserved for people who do not have the facts on their side. I had the facts, and I preferred to beat them with documented facts. I spent the next 5 hours building a master legal dossier. It was not a colorful, polished slide deck filled with meaningless corporate synergy buzzwords. It was a cold, methodical record built on documents. I compiled my original, physically dated laboratory notebooks, clearly showing the exact chemical formulas I had developed 2 full years before Blackridge thermal systems ever existed. I included high-resolution photographs of the alpha prototypes built on my own laboratory bench. I printed the email from Samuel Dyer explicitly forbidding the executive team from claiming permanent ownership of the technology without my voluntary, formal signature. To completely destroy Evelyn's narrative, I included the raw digital metadata proving she had ordered the retroactive intellectual property sweep only after the Argent lawyers had started asking difficult questions. And finally, acting as the absolute killing blow, I attached the original, unaltered thermal degradation reports, proving Grant Vail had deliberately compromised the safety architecture to save 14 cents per battery cell. With the evidence perfectly structured, I drafted a completely new contract of return. It was exactly 4 pages long. I did not ask for a massive equity share, a multi-million-dollar apology bonus, or a golden parachute. I demanded the immediate creation of a fully independent safety and compliance office, equipped with the absolute legal authority to halt any production line in the company without requiring executive board approval. I demanded a mandatory engineering attribution protocol, ensuring that no technical document could ever be presented to a buyer or investor without the original inventor's name explicitly printed on the title page. I demanded a rigorous, legally binding anti-retaliation mechanism strictly enforced by outside human resources auditors. And finally, I demanded a transparent, public licensing agreement for the Cascade Shield technology, clearly establishing my absolute ownership and the company's conditional, highly regulated right to use it. I handed the printed term sheet to Judith Rowan in a quiet corridor outside the main executive suites. She read the 4 pages in complete, heavy silence. When she finally finished reading, she looked up at me, and I saw a flash of profound, bitter regret cross her face. The demands I had placed on the table were not the aggressive, hostile takeover tactics of a greedy corporate hostage taker. They were simply the basic, fundamental ethical standards that Blackridge thermal systems should have been operating under for the last 5 years. It was a brutal, inescapable realization for the chairwoman of the board. The great corporate crisis, currently threatening to destroy their $950 million empire, was not caused by my unreasonable technical demands. It was caused by the sheer, unadulterated absence of basic corporate decency at the highest levels of her company. As I turned to walk toward the main boardroom for the final closed-door session, Grant Vail suddenly stepped out of a side office and intercepted me. He looked entirely wrecked. His expensive designer suit was deeply wrinkled, and the arrogant, polished swagger that had defined his entire rapid career ascent was completely gone. He stepped directly into my path, looking around nervously to ensure no corporate security officers were listening to us. "Maya, please," Grant whispered, his voice vibrating with desperate, pathetic panic. "We can find a middle ground here. I still have significant influence with the Argent strategy team. I can make you the Chief Innovation Ambassador. It is a beautiful title. You get a massive corner office, a massive bump in your base salary, and an unlimited global travel budget. You become the highly visible public face of the entire engineering division. In exchange, you just sign a joint ownership agreement. Keep the compromised adhesive data out of the official record, and let me stay on as the lead integration executive for the merger. We save the deal together. We both win." It was a deeply insulting compromise. He was offering me a hollow title and asking me to protect a deal he had already wrecked. He still genuinely believed I cared about corner offices and beautiful job titles. I looked at Grant with absolute, freezing indifference. "You do not have a middle ground to offer, Grant," I said. my voice completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy. "You are trying to trade an empty office for a technology you absolutely do not own, just to save a career you have already destroyed. I am not an ambassador. I am the architect. And you are not the one who built this." I stepped past him without waiting for a reply, leaving him standing frozen in the hallway. Just as my hand touched the heavy brass handle of the boardroom door, my phone buzzed with an automated priority alert from the legal server. It was the final ultimatum from Argent Fleet Mobility. The message was brutally short and entirely uncompromising. If Blackridge Thermal Systems did not completely resolve the patent ownership dispute, permanently remove the compromised safety materials from the supply chain, and present a fully authorized legal clearance by exactly 12 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, they were officially withdrawing their $950 million offer and notifying the Federal Trade Commission of the failed safety data. The stakes were no longer theoretical. Time had run out. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and walked into the room to decide the fate of the entire company. The notification glaring on my phone screen was a death sentence for the entire acquisition. Argent Fleet Mobility had officially drawn their final line in the sand. Their legal counsel transmitted the formal ultimatum directly to the Blackridge Board of Directors. If we did not present a totally unassailable chain of title for the Cascade Shield patent, along with a complete remediation plan for the compromised thermal adhesive, by exactly 12 o'clock noon the following day, the $950 million deal would be permanently terminated. Furthermore, Argent threatened to immediately notify federal transit authorities about the intentionally obscured safety data. The window for corporate maneuvering was completely slammed shut. We were operating in a timeline measured in hours, not financial quarters. Despite her official suspension, Evelyn Sloan was granted one final opportunity to present her defense to the Internal Investigative Committee that afternoon. She walked into the secure briefing room flanked by two highly expensive personal defense attorneys. She did not look like a woman facing potential federal fraud charges. She looked incredibly smug, carrying a single crisp manila envelope. "I told you this was a massive overreaction," Evelyn announced, sliding a freshly printed document across the table toward Judith Rowan. My legal team spent the entire night scouring the archived physical files from the previous administration. We located the missing link. It is an unexecuted, but fully drafted, absolute transfer of ownership commissioned directly by Samuel Dyer 3 weeks before his passing. It clearly outlines his explicit intent to absorb the intellectual property entirely into the corporate holding structure. The paperwork was simply delayed by his sudden death. The intent was always for the company to own it completely. Judith looked down at the paper. It looked authentic. It had the correct historical letterhead and the standard formatting used by the legal department 4 years ago. My personal legal counsel, sitting quietly to my right, reached across the table and picked up the document. He did not bother reading the legal jargon. Instead, he pulled a small optical scanner from his briefcase, scanned the page into his laptop, and ran a deep diagnostic on the embedded digital watermark and printer microdots. It took exactly 3 minutes for the polished illusion to completely shatter. "This is a fascinating piece of historical evidence, Evelyn," my lawyer said, turning his laptop screen around so the entire investigative committee could see the glaring red text on his diagnostic report. "Particularly because the digital footprint embedded in the printer ink confirms this specific page was generated on the executive floor printer exactly 48 hours ago, right after the Argent deal initially froze. You did not find a lost historical document. You manufactured a fraudulent one over the weekend to cover your tracks." The silence in the room was completely suffocating. Evelyn's high-priced defense attorneys physically leaned away from her, instantly realizing their client had just handed them a forged document to present to a corporate board. Nolan Price, sitting near the corner of the table, completely crumbled under the pressure of the revelation. His face turned a sickly shade of white. "We all implicitly understood that her work was considered work for hire," Nolan stammered, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to distance himself from Evelyn's blatant forgery while still defending the original legal position. It was an unspoken assumption across the entire executive suite. We funded her laboratory, we paid her salary. The exact, executed paperwork was just an administrative formality we simply lost track of. Judith Rowan stared at her chief legal counsel with absolute, freezing contempt. An unspoken assumption, Judith repeated slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of the phrase hang in the air. You built a $950 million valuation on an unspoken assumption, and when the buyers asked for proof, your department either ignored the gap or actively allowed the chief executive officer to forge a backdated contract. Your statement does not absolve you, Nolan. It merely proves to this board that you are either phenomenally incompetent or an active co-conspirator in federal corporate fraud. Nolan had nothing left to say. The last remaining pillar of Evelyn's defense had collapsed. The committee adjourned for the evening, leaving everyone to prepare for the final, official judgment hearing scheduled for the following morning. I returned to my quiet apartment, exhausted but entirely focused. I laid my master dossier out on my dining table, checking every date, every signature, and every piece of compromised testing data. I had enough ammunition to end Evelyn's career permanently. At 8 o'clock that evening, a bonded courier knocked on my front door. He carried a small, heavy, dust-covered cardboard box secured with heavy packing tape. The return address belonged to the estate law firm that had managed Samuel Dyer's personal assets after his death. An attached letter from the senior estate partner explained the sudden delivery. While clearing out a secondary off-site storage facility to finalize the closing of the estate, a junior clerk had discovered a mislabeled box. It had been sitting in the dark for 4 years, completely forgotten due to a simple clerical error in the archiving system. It was addressed directly to me. I cut the heavy tape with a kitchen knife. Inside, resting on a bed of old packing paper, was a single, analog digital voice recorder and a handwritten note from Samuel. The ink was faded, but his handwriting was unmistakable. I pressed the play button. The small speaker crackled with static before Samuel's deep, tired voice filled my quiet living room. "Maya," the recording began, his tone heavy with the undeniable exhaustion of his failing health. "If you are listening to this, I am gone, and the corporate vultures have likely started circling the laboratory. I know our legal counsel wants me to finalize the absolute transfer of your patent. I know it would make the balance sheets look significantly better for future investors, but I deliberately stopped the paperwork." I sat down slowly, staring at the small black device. "I built this company because I love engineering." Samuel's voice continued, a fierce, protective edge rising in his tone. "But I know exactly what happens when the pure finance people take over. They view engineers as expendable ornaments. They view safety margins as flexible suggestions. They will eventually try to cut corners to maximize their quarterly returns. And they will use your brilliant architecture to cover their terrible decisions. Keeping the foundational patent legally registered in your name is not an administrative mistake. It is my final, deliberate strategy." I closed my eyes, listening to the man who had given me my first real chance. "You are the fail-safe, Maya," Samuel concluded, his voice fading slightly. "As long as you hold the actual keys to the technology, they cannot completely corrupt it without your permission. Do not let them steal your voice. Do not let them compromise the safety of the people who rely on us. Use the leverage. Stop them the moment they try to touch the foundation." The recording clicked off, leaving my apartment in total silence. I had spent the last 3 years feeling completely isolated, fighting a shadow war against an executive suite that constantly tried to erase me. But sitting in the dark, I finally understood that I was never actually fighting alone. Samuel had seen the exact future, and he had deliberately armed me with the ultimate weapon to stop it. The next morning, the sky over Detroit was heavy and gray. I walked through the grand glass lobby of the Blackridge headquarters for what might be the final time. The security guards, usually completely indifferent to the engineering staff, watched me closely as I crossed the polished marble floor. The invisible, crushing weight of the impending decision settled firmly onto my shoulders. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor. I held a sleek black briefcase containing my original research, the compromised safety reports, the forged metadata, and Samuel's final, devastating audio confession. I was walking into the room with the absolute power to completely kill the massive acquisition, flawlessly save the transit deal, or entirely obliterate the toxic power structure that had ruthlessly crushed the technical staff for years. My entire path depended strictly on presenting the absolute truth in the exact, unassailable sequence. I walked down the quiet, tense hallway and entered the main glass-walled boardroom. The air inside was completely stagnant, thick with unspoken panic and monumental financial stakes. The representatives from Argent Fleet Mobility sat rigidly on one side of the vast table. The Blackridge Board of Directors sat on the other. Evelyn Sloan and Grant Vale were positioned near the far corner, looking like prisoners waiting for a final verdict. Judith Rowan stood at the head of the table. She looked at me, then looked at the massive legal team surrounding us. She reached out and pressed a button on the wall console. The heavy electronic locks on the double oak doors engaged with a loud, absolute click, sealing us entirely inside. "Turn off all cellular devices," Judith ordered, her voice cutting through the tension like a steel blade. "No exceptions. As of this exact minute, this room is completely sealed. I am declaring this a formal, binding investigative tribunal. Every single word spoken in this room from this moment forward will be entered into the permanent legal minutes, and every statement carries full, inescapable personal liability." Judith sat down, folded her hands on the polished mahogany, and turned her sharp gaze directly toward me. "The floor is yours. Maya, tear it down." I stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table. I did not raise my voice, and I did not pace. I simply opened the black briefcase and began laying out the physical architecture of their destruction. I presented the complete, unbroken timeline of events. I started with my initial independent research, establishing the absolute origin of the invention long before I ever walked through the doors of Blackridge Thermal Systems. I produced the original, time-stamped licensing option, highlighting the strict 36-month expiration clause. I showed them exactly when the corporate exclusivity died. Then, I pivoted to the safety data. I handed the Argent Fleet Mobility executives the raw, unaltered thermal degradation reports, proving the cheaper adhesive substitute had fundamentally compromised the structural integrity of the battery cells. Finally, I connected the dots, showing how my sudden termination was not a human resources decision, but a desperate, synchronized cover-up to hide both the expired patent and the lethal safety flaw from a $950 million buyer. Evelyn Sloan leaned forward, her face a mask of furious desperation. "This is entirely circumstantial. We have the signed transfer intent from Samuel Dyer. The company owns the foundational rights." I looked at my digital forensics attorney. He stood up and projected his diagnostic report onto the massive screen behind us. "The document Evelyn Sloan provided yesterday is a complete digital forgery," my lawyer stated, his voice echoing in the sealed room. "The embedded metadata and printer microdots conclusively prove the file was generated and physically printed exactly 48 hours ago, immediately after the acquisition was suspended. It was fraudulently backdated to appear as a historical artifact." A collective gasp rippled through the board of directors. Forging a legal document during a massive corporate merger was not just a fireable offense, it was a federal crime. But I was not finished. "Samuel Dyer did not intend for you to own my work, Evelyn, and I do not expect anyone to simply take my word for it." I pulled the small analog voice recorder from my briefcase, set it in the exact center of the table, and pressed play. The heavy, tired voice of the late founder filled the completely silent boardroom. Samuel's final strategy session played out exactly as he had recorded it 4 years ago. He explicitly stated that keeping the patent in my name was his ultimate safeguard against future executives treating the engineering staff like disposable ornaments. He called out the exact type of reckless to profit-driven leadership that Evelyn represented, warning that I needed to keep the keys to prevent the technology from being corrupted. When the tape clicked off, The room felt devoid of oxygen. Evelyn Sloan sat entirely paralyzed. Her perfectly manicured corporate armor had completely shattered. In a matter of minutes, every lie she had built over the past 3 years collapsed. The lead executive from Argent Fleet Mobility stood up. He did not look at Evelyn. He looked directly at Judith Rowan and then at me. Argent Fleet Mobility is prepared to proceed with the $950 million acquisition, the Argent executive announced firmly. However, our terms have fundamentally changed. We will only move forward if the Cascade Shield patent is transparently licensed directly from Maya Perry. The physical safety design must be immediately reverted to the original, uncompromised materials. And finally, the person in charge of technical architecture must have absolute, unchallengeable authority over product safety. Judith Rowan did not wait for a single counter-argument. She had seen enough blood on the floor. Evelyn Sloan, you are officially terminated for cause, effective immediately, Judith declared, her voice colder than ice. You will receive no severance package, and the board will fully cooperate with any federal regulatory investigations regarding your actions. Grant Vale, your employment is terminated, and you are immediately remanded to an internal fraud review regarding the unauthorized supply chain alterations. Nolan Price did not wait for his name to be called. The chief legal counsel stood up, his hands shaking violently, and formally tendered his immediate resignation, quietly admitting he had buried the legal warnings to protect Evelyn's public image. Within 60 seconds, the entire toxic executive regime was completely eradicated. I did not return to the laboratory as a token apology, and I did not accept a meaningless honorary title just to make the corporate letterhead look pretty. When the dust finally settled, I was named the Chief Technology and Safety Officer of Blackridge Thermal Systems. I demanded, and received, a direct reporting line to the board of directors and an absolute veto power over any critical safety modifications. The $950 million deal was officially saved, but the underlying structure of the company was entirely rebuilt. We established a public licensing contract for my patent, mandatory technical checkpoints for all manufacturing lines, a strict, formalized attribution mechanism for all engineering staff, and a legally binding, written commitment against corporate retaliation. Late that afternoon, the studio lights were turned back on in the executive boardroom. The cameras were positioned exactly where they had been days ago. The massive leather binder was placed back in the center of the mahogany table. I sat in the exact chair where Evelyn had tried to hand me my termination papers. Only this time, she was gone, escorted out of the building by the very security guards she had called for me. I picked up the heavy silver fountain pen. With the investors, the board of directors, and the Argent executives watching, I was the absolute last person to sign the closing documents. For the first time in the history of the company, the entire industry heard the real name of the person who actually built the foundation and kept the system standing. Evelyn did not lose because I yelled louder in a boardroom. She lost because in modern America, sometimes a woman with a perfect paper trail, a patent registered in her correct name, and the absolute truth arranged in the right order can end the career of a powerful chief executive officer faster and more permanently than any dramatic speech ever could. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you'd like more stories like this, please like, subscribe, and share the video.